Redditors who clean up crime scenes, what's the most bizarre thing you've witnessed? My best friend used to have this job. Most of the bizarre stuff was cleaning up suicides. Found a guy's full intact mustache across the room when he blew his head off with a shotgun. One guy tried to kill himself by shooting his stomach with a small caliber pistol. He didn't die immediately, so he wrote tons of whacked out stuff on the walls with his blood, then finished the job. Next story was dispatched to a vehicle versus pedestrian call a couple months ago, and when we arrived on scene, it was like something out of a movie. Dude was running across a fairly busy 4-lane road and was hit by a car traveling about 55 mph. After his head went through the windshield of the first vehicle, he then proceeded to be thrown into the opposite lane and was ran over and dragged about 20 yards by another vehicle. Once the coroner was on scene with traffic investigations, we proceeded to pick up his organs bit by bit. It was a fantastic anatomy lesson. Next story.
Crime scene cleaner here. My first suicide cleanup was quite an experience. Man shot himself in the head in his garage. I'll never forget needing to use pliers to pull teeth and skull fragments out of the drywall behind where he sat, or that blood and brain managed to make its way more than 50 feet across the garage. Most disturbing, though, was his pickup. We chose to take it to our company wash bay to pressure wash it and make sure it was as clean as possible. I cleaned it myself and was satisfied that I had done well. Inspected for blood and couldn't find it, so I began driving it back to the owner's garage. On the way back, a slight drizzle began and switched on the wiper blades. Imagine my horror as a chunk of brain streaks across my newly cleaned windshield. I pulled over quickly and cleaned it up, but it still makes me sick to think what would have happened if its poor wife or daughter would have been met with that sight and been crushed again by the impact of suicide. That was 10 years ago, and I'll never forget it. Now I triple or quadruple check every job. Next story. My job is to clear landmines. I clean war crimes, you can say. Yay, bit of a stretch, I know. Recently, a cow had walked into a minefield in our area of operations and stepped on a small anti-personnel mine. However, this mine was boosted by having been buried on top of a directional fragmentation mine. Gamers and soldiers, think Claymore, but bigger. The cow had literally been split in half, with cow intestines spread hanging from trees like Hannibal's Christmas ornaments. Next story. Family member did heavy-duty cleaning, including crime scenes. A guy shot his head off with a shotgun. EMTs were supposed to pick him up, literally, but missed a large chunk of brain behind a couch. That was when said family member decided to find other engagement. Next story. Work on the weekends for a funeral home. It's decent money for what is essentially 2 hours of call-out work when their normal staff is off. Last year, I was called in at around 5 in the morning. A 30-something-year-old guy had shot himself, in a pretty small 2-bedroom apartment. That wasn't the bizarre part at all, since I've seen it before on call-outs. What was bizarre was what was in the apartment. Literally thousands of documents piled on the floor, on a desk, on shelves, of people's financial information. Credit card statements, bank statements, personal data, etc. Probably 3,000 folders with all this stuff in. Even where there weren't piles of folders, there were just loose papers, magnetic cards, surveillance cameras. It was just the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And of course, some of these documents and folders had blood and brains spattered all over. Didn't matter to me though, since the detective on scene had said it was fine. Police had to clear a path by collecting the papers from the route we would take from the he was. A couple of months later, it came out that the guy had over $1 million in cash and Bitcoin. Apparently, the state police were on. Next story.
I don't clean up crime scenes, but I do remove the deceased. I can get into more accurate detail of the deceased, but here's some general stuff. Hoarders are a lot more common than they really should be, first of all, and it's never a clean hoard. It's piles of junk covered in several types of urine, shit, and vomit. Molds I've never seen before, and probably insects that haven't even been discovered. I understand when the emergency services don't want to be in that kind of house longer than they have to, but I'll never forget having to ask them to help me because I couldn't distinguishing what was actually the deceased and what was just a piles of random shit that looked more human than the deceased did. People will warn you, bodies will bloat, and touching them the wrong way will make them leak. But the image you're conjuring up doesn't even hold a light to what it can be like. Insects skittering when you delicately lift a 400 lelby's deceased onto your cot, because one wrong move and they will start oozing. Oh, and the ones who had pets who were so desperate they had to eat their owner, staring into the eyes of a big brown-eyed mutt who is happy to finally receive human contact, and all you can't think about is how the deceased is missing their entire face. Poor things were just hungry, but it's unsettling. I clean up suicides, decomps, where the person has been dead for days or weeks before being found, and crime scene. You find the obvious stuff like sex toys, drug paraphernalia. One time, I found a maybe fictional, maybe autobiographical journal of how this guy lost his testicles in an angle grinder accident. This same guy had a small metal pipe, like a weed one-hitter, along with some kind of dried fruit, like cherries or small plums, hidden in a box in his closet. It was like he was smoking it. IDK. We are pretty versed in the world of drugs, and we couldn't figure that shit out. As many first responders have already pointed out, the amount of brain and skull fragments left behind is a lot bigger than what I would have imagined. Shit, they'll leave eyeballs behind. I've seen over half of an intact brain, a skull fragment big enough to use as a bowl, teeth. They get the biggest part of the body and roll out. They're not going to spend an hour looking for all the giblets. That's why they pay us the big bucks. What's strange to me is that a lot of adults go to their parents' house to kill themselves. Kinda fucked up. Suicide season is not during the holiday. We are way more busy during spring than the end of the year. The most eerie thing is how often we do suicides in rooms that just look normal. It's hard to explain, but it's just strange to go into a normal looking bedroom with a half-drank Gatorade on the dresser, a half-read book on the nightstand, and a big old bloodstain on the floor. Also, seeing the different ways the families cope with the tragedy. Our service is expensive, and there's been times I thought I was gonna get hit when I told them our estimated price, especially if it's grandma or grandpa that swallowed a bullet and half the fucking family tree is at the house. I've done suicides as young as 12 and as old as 80s. You get the people that are just on autopilot that ask weird questions, cause they really aren't on the same plane of existence. We tear out all the carpet in a room if a gun is used. CSF is clear and is also a BBP carrier, so if it looks clean, it might still be contaminated. We've had the carpet pulled and removed, and I've had family members ask, while they're looking at the slab concrete, if we are just gonna shampoo the carpet. You get the people that seem almost happy that the person is gone. I've heard people say, well, now that their kid is gone, we can finally take that cruise. IDK if it's just a coping mechanism or if they're just massive asshole. I try not to judge. Next story.
Years ago, some fellas working at an abattoir get a request to help unblock a tank. The tank is like a silo and holds blood from the cattle. Don't ask me, I have no idea what they do with it. Anyway, they open the top and one guy climbs in. Once in, he falls from the ladder and into the vat. The next guy sees this, climbs in yelling to the boss that there is a problem. The second guy falls as well, and then boss gets up there and sees the guys in the tank, and yep, he went in. Others had heard the yelling and saw the guys going in and all gathered at the tank. My dad was one of these guys. Most stood around the bottom of the tank while others worked to open the bottom vent. They finally got it open, old blood spewed everywhere, and someone used some sort of hook thing to drag the guys out the bottom. They wheel unconscious and two weren't breathing. My dad stripped a guy and did CPR until help arrived. The ammonia smell that the blood produced was what knocked them out. The guys weren't trained for maintenance in that area. That same smell clung to my dad for 5 days. No matter what he did, it stuck, and he had to sleep in the spare room till it faded. He lost a heap of weight, cause even with gloves on, he couldn't stand the smell on his hands near his face. The third guy lived, but the two young fellas died. Next story.
A family friend removes the deceased from their homes, etc., since they own their own funeral home. They said that the weirdest thing they saw was a woman lying face up in a tub and a man laying on top of her. When she took them apart, she knew why they were like that. Guy had domestic abuse problems and they were going through a separation. Kids in the other room, mom in the bathroom doing her hair. The guy comes in and just stabs her several times, puts her in the tub, and places the knife in her hands while he jumps on top of her and stabs himself either in the chest or abdomen and bleeds out. She said she'll never forget how sad and unusual it was, especially for those kids who thankfully were asleep. I think her mom found them. I hate thinking about it, and I hope that family can heal. Next story. I don't clean them for a living, but had to clean a few apartments when my uncle managed an apartment complex. We had one tenant OD on heroin. He sat there for roughly 3 weeks before anyone noticed the smell. They took his body and left it to us to clean up. The dude vomited on the ceiling. There were little dry droplets of vomit all over the ceiling right above where he died, and to top it off, he basically liquefied and left a puddle of gut juices on the concrete foundation underneath the carpet. Thought that shit was left to a professional team, but I guess it's optional, and if you don't want to pay for it, you can scoop the brains and blood up yourself. Next story.
Used to do CSI work and was an autopsy tech, so I would both go to the scene, investigate, bring the body back to the morgue, and help with the autopsy. Anyways, this person murdered their spouse and stuffed the body into a fridge and buried it in the woods. When you have a body exposed to the elements, you have normal decomposition to look forward to, such as insects, bloating gases, skin coming off, bones showing, etc. Once you've seen a few, then you know that this kind of decomp state of body is normal and you know what to expect. There are varying levels of stuff you deal with, but it's all within an expected spectrum of the job. Hope that makes sense. However, in this case, this person was sealed in, so you didn't have any of that. They were essentially stewing in there for almost a year. Might have been longer, I don't remember the exact time. I wasn't there on scene when they found the person, only in the morgue to help with the autopsy. So I prep the room, doctor comes in, and I pull out the body from the fridge and wheel them into where we do the actual autopsy. Opened the bag, and oh my god, the smell. I'll never, ever forget the smell. I've dealt with bodies in various stages of death and decomposition, but holy shit, this was on 10 other levels. Now the morgue has HVAC, air filters, fresheners, and all that, but they weren't effective at all for the smell. It was so bad I gagged, which I've never done before. before, and almost threw up in my mask. The doctor was struggling too. The doc double-backed and almost looked like they were gonna faint. It was the purest, worst, most concentrated, extremely pungent ammonia smell you could think of. I had never smelled anything like that in my career at that point. If wine ages well and is better with time, this ammonia smell did the exact opposite, and it was somewhere worse than anything you could think of. The smell stuck to us too, on our skin, for about a week, no matter how hard I scrubbed. I can still smell it if I think about it. The texture of the body didn't help either. It was so slippery and wet that flecks of the ammonia fluid splashed onto my skin. The long gloves went up to my forearm, not all the way to my scrubs. It was the worst autopsy of my life. It took about 3 hours because we kept having to take breaks, and it was a difficult body to work on due to how fragile it was. It beat out everything else I saw, from the crazy accident fatalities, the interesting suicides, to even the person who had half their face eaten by rats and half their body covered in a sea of maggots and insects. Next story.
I've been a funeral director for over 20 years. I've seen every kind of suicide you can think of. Shotguns, handguns, hollow points, full metal jackets. But one case still haunts me, even now. It was more than 15 years ago. I got a call to help another funeral home with a coroner pickup way out on a dairy farm. That funeral home helps us a lot, so no big deal. When we pulled up, there were 2 state troopers still there, unusual, and about 20 people just standing around outside the farmhouse. Silent, staring. You could feel the weight in the air. The funeral director talked with the family and the cops, then came back to get me. He didn't say a word, just motioned for the stretcher. The look on his face was enough to tell me this wasn't going to be normal. We stepped inside, and I swear to God it looked like a horror movie. Blood was everywhere, everywhere. It was like someone took half a dozen industrial-sized cans of red spray paint and just detonated them in the middle of the room. The walls were dripping, the ceiling was splattered. The hardwood floor was so soaked it squelched under our boots. The windows, shattered, and the glass still had veins of blood and hair stuck to it. There were flies too, thousands. A churning black cloud of them buzzing around the room, drunk on blood and tissue. The smell, sweet metallic rot mixed with alcohol and something brainy. You never forget that smell. In the middle of it all was what was left of the deceased. He was maybe 18 or 19. And I say what was left because there was no face. No head, really. Just a jawbone hanging off a shredded neck. The rest, his skull, brain, everything above the shoulders, was vaporized. Gone. Scattered across the room in wet pink-gray shrapnel. The ceiling fan was on high, and it had flung gore in every direction. Chunks of meat and skulls stuck to the blades, rotating lazily like a grotesque mobile. He had taken a .30-06 rifle, shoved the barrel in his mouth, and pulled the trigger. We found out later he'd been living on the farm, working there, trying to do right. 10 months before, he and his girlfriend had a baby. Things got rocky. The day before, her father called and told him he'd never see his kid again. So he drank a handle of bottom-shelf vodka, smashed every window in the house with his bare fists, then made his final decision. After we got his remains into a bag, we started the grim job of picking up fragments of skull and brain. Fingernail-sized bits of bone, jelly-like globs of brain tissue stuck to curtain rods, baseboards, even inside the HVAC vents. I try to clean when I can, but this was way beyond anything I could handle. It looked like a slaughterhouse. As we carried him out, I saw her, the girlfriend, standing alone, away from everyone else. She held their baby. The child couldn't have been more than a few months old. She didn't cry. She didn't move. Just stood there like stone, with that little life in her arms and all, that death behind her, that image, her and the baby, framed by that blood-soaked house. That's what stuck with me, still does.